Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Jonathan Dexter, Senior Director of Engineering at Nerdery, and your host and moderator today for a virtual edition of Nerd Therapy, Humanizing Health Through Service Design. For those of you attending for the first time, Nerd Therapy is both an event and a community of digitally focused business leaders, product owners, strategists, designers, and engineers working at the leading edge of technology to invent a world that works better for all. Before we introduce our panelists, a few housekeeping items. We will start with a guided panel discussion, and then we will be asking for your questions. Please use the Q&A functionality at the bottom of Zoom in order to ask your questions, and feel free to upvote your favorites. Without further ado, let's get into it. I'd like to introduce our great panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Adam Dunford, UX principal, design principal at 3M in the Healthcare Business Group. Adam, it's great to have you with us.
Oops, happy to be here.
I'd also like to introduce Ashley Pfeiffelmann, Director of Experience Design for Nerdery.
Hello.
Also joining us is Rebecca Pineault, Global Head of Digital Experience Strategy and Design at Takeda.
Hello, I'm looking forward to the conversation.
And last but not least, Sara Saldoff, Senior Director of Product Management and Customer Experience at Ohio Health.
Hi, everyone.
Great. So this is a big topic, and I'd like to kind of level set us with our first question here. So Ashley, maybe this is a great place for you to start. I'd love to ask you, hey, for those of us out there who might be exploring service design and new to this world, what is service design and how does it differ from experience design?
Sure. So service design is a methodology just like experience design. Within service design, they use similar terminology to the theater. You've got your front stage, which is anything that the consumer can see, and you have the backstage, which is anything that is hidden and it's more behind the scenes. So within service design, a good principle is to kind of look at the 3 Ps. We've got the process, the people, and the props. So a process could be something like looking at how a user may schedule an appointment. The people would be the people that they're involved with. So this could be the scheduling nurse, the provider, contacting customer support, or possibly talking with someone like their caretaker. And then props would be any tools that they use along the way. So the website, making a phone call, utilizing an app, or any digital or physical sign that they may come into contact with along their way.
Fantastic. And Adam, I'd love to also ask you, you've had, a pretty significant career in design in general. How does service design fit into the bigger picture in your experience of human-centered design?
Well, I think ultimately the most effective user experience designers are human-centered. So I don't think that it's necessarily a complete shift when you move to service design, but I really think when you talk about what it is you're looking at, you're moving beyond the screen, right? You're moving beyond a digital experience. And so really, I think it's becoming more humanizing when you consider that someone's experience or interaction with an organization goes from the very first touch point, be it an email or an invite or a connection at the front desk, all the way through potentially a digital medium or digital application. And then what happens afterwards? How do they reflect or respond to that? So I think that the part where I think service design brings us closer to being connected to complete humans rather than just the users of our applications or interfaces.
That's really interesting. And so as we think about service design and having that complete interaction, Sara, how have you seen that sort of aspect be leveraged in the industries you've had experience in, whether it be retail or now in healthcare? And how do we bring those lessons forward to make that holistic experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just start with healthcare for right now, but I think we always say that we're the flashlight team. So we go in and we start to ask the questions and understand where the friction points are. And while my team does build the digital experiences, at the end of the day, what you find is that it's the before and the after and the during. It's not just that particular experience that people are having problems with. In particular with healthcare, that's where operations is a critical partner for us. So I'll give an example. We built an amazing scheduling tool online for our app and for our website, and it was great, and users loved it. And at the time, 4 years ago when we built it, we weren't working very closely with our operational partners. We set it out into the world to get used, and then it basically didn't produce any results because guess what? We didn't have enough appointments to actually fill the experience. And so we were like, oh, we should have gotten operations involved much sooner, because then they could have helped push all of the operational scheduling appointments into the system and into the experience that we were creating. So for us, it's really about thinking more broadly than just the digital experience. It's how do you connect all of the parts and pieces together?
Yeah. I'd love to hear, Rebecca, to your perspective of not engaging just the user in developing these sort of healthcare services and technologies, but also engaging those business partners. How have you seen in your experience successfully balancing both of those demands and both of those stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sara really hit it on the head, right? As experience designers, a lot of times we focus on what is the experience, and we are focused on user centricity and co-creation. But what the service map does that I've found really useful is because it is looking at front stage, the experience stuff that most of us designers tend to think about most, but it's looking at what are those processes and systems that are needed in the backstage that enable that front stage experience to happen. But then going down, right, what are the capabilities that are needed? Do we have that capability? The call center, when they answer the call and a user has a question about, hey, I just signed up for acupuncture benefits on your app, and the call center is like, oh, I didn't even know we had an app, right? Then immediately that experience for the customer breaks down. So the ideation and the experience is great, but when it comes to executing, you have to think all the way from experience down to, do we need to hire people? Do we need to train people? Do we have the capabilities and the data and the connections to actually be able to create that meaningful experience that we have envisioned?
Yeah, I'd love to kind of maybe drill into that a little bit more, because I think that sometimes, at least in my experience and what I've heard, is that there can be challenges associated with kind of developing this broader service design perspective. And Adam, I'd love to ask you, how have you worked on kind of overcoming those challenges, whether it's, a stakeholder that says, no, I know what to do here, and I'm not going to engage these other, whether it's the users or the operational partners. And how do you bring that full service design mindset to stakeholders that want to push forward a technical solution?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm a passionate believer in the workshop.
Well, I think Rebecca.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Adam, if you could go ahead and answer that. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Actually, I was going to build on what Rebecca just said. Is this idea that when it comes to the groups that we ordinarily work with, we often have stakeholders who do trust us, digital development teams. It's when we move outside that of how do we create a connection to the call center? How do we create a connection to the salespeople? How do we find ways to talk? And a lot of times it's about shifting our language of what are the values that are important to them? What is the touch point, or even sometimes in some cases, the metrics that are important to them, of saying, okay, call center, you may not think of time on phone as an important aspect, or maybe it is, but how do we translate that into the user's experience? And so I found that when talking to stakeholders, it is about shifting our language and understanding what parts of the, again, user experience or that interaction with the customer are the ones that are the most important.
Rebecca, I'm sorry for cutting you off. I'm sure, what were you saying too?
No, I was just I think in terms of bringing those stakeholders together, right, is when you build out the service map and you talk about, here's the experience and here's all the things that live below it that you need to enable that experience. And if you don't have the right stakeholders, right, there's a lot of empty boxes on the map. And I think just by throwing that on the wall and allowing the stakeholders that maybe you have some resistance from to engage the parties across an organization, potentially even relationships with third parties into that working session, they'll be able to, without me having to try to sell them on it, they'll be able to see, oh no, right, there's all these blank boxes. Now I understand where you're coming from. Now I get the big questions that we need to get answered. And yes, we need to engage the right stakeholders to fill out the full service map.
I think it's also.
Oh, go ahead, Sarah. You go.
I think it's a shift in how people talk about things, in the sense that you can come at something from being very solutions oriented, right? And so a lot of our stakeholders also come to the table with like, here's what I want, give me this specific thing. But when we start to have the conversation of what problem are you trying to solve, it's a very different and much more enriching conversation. And that's where the empathy part comes in. And so I found that when we are able to shift that conversation, we're actually able to bring more people to the table. And it's a much deeper conversation because they're able to express like what's frustrating them and where that friction lies, versus like, I want you to, design this piece of paper and, give it to me tomorrow, or whatever, the case may be.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it also just helps gain prioritization within the organization. If you had one-off conversations with someone from the operational team, and then you went and talked with some providers within oncology, for example, and then you talk to providers within neurology, you're going to find very different answers. But if you can get everyone aligned and make sure that we're all talking about solving the right problem, then we can start to all speak the same language and understand, okay, these are the problems that we really need to focus on solving, and just get alignment within the business first and foremost.
I think that's great. And I really want to kind of zoom in, I think, on a few things that we said there. I love the idea that we spoke about of, that blank boxes and letting people come to the conclusion. And the idea of empathy and making sure that, hey, we're thinking about everybody and bringing them along. I'm curious, as far as your experience, Rebecca, what problems have you seen service design solve, or do you feel like service design is really well suited to help solve for patients or care providers or physicians, people who might not necessarily be familiar with it in their day-to-day job?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we see more and more, I come from an agency background, so I always say client side, but more and more organizations are hiring teams like all of us, right, internally. So I think service design as part of our skill set is becoming more familiar to a lot of people. But it is different. And I don't think people always understand the amount of thinking and strategy that needs to go into executing even something simple. Like I worked with a payer and we wanted to do something as simple as a digital ID card. Right? So health insurance, I have an app, I see a digital ID card. So by doing the service map, we were able to get into the data to understand that because they sell to other companies, they're in the commercial market, we couldn't actually get the information and email addresses from the organization into the payer database to be able to deliver something that, as experienced designers, we're like, okay, how easy, right? Table stakes. Why wouldn't you have an electronic ID? And it wasn't until like you start questioning, and all of us kind of missed it. And then we got into, oh, well, how are we going to get the email addresses to send them this email to tell them to get this ID? And then it was like, oh, we get 20% of emails from companies. So it was like, okay, well, that idea, technical feasibility or business feasibility is like through the roof, right? Design and stuff is tiny. And so being able to understand those impacts and the amount of work to be done across all the different things that need to happen allows you then, right, to get to that prioritization and be able to evaluate. Do we spend all our resources trying to build a better connection between the payer and their customers? Or do we say, you know what, that's too hard. We're going to focus on a different initiative that's a little easier for us to achieve.
Yeah. And Adam, how about your perspective? How have you seen service design in the healthcare industry evolve and maybe grow as it's been adopted?
So for us at 3M specifically, and so I'll speak from the experience I'm having now, the software that we create is primarily for the payer market and the provider market to work together. It's not customer facing. So this is enterprise sales. These are cases where a large healthcare organization spends lots of money to install software that's going to support a documentation process. It's really fascinating work, but it does mean that you're disconnected from the people who are actually doing the coding and documentation, from the people who are doing the purchasing, even the people who are actually doing the customer engagement. The customer people, the account managers, they're talking to an executive, whereas the people who are on the ground are the ones who are doing the work. And so a lot of what ends up happening is you're trying to create a a broader picture for people who really aren't interested in that broader picture. They have their silo, they have their needs, they have the things that they're focusing on. And so it's about saying, how can you create a broader understanding that we're all in this together, that if we make a great onboarding process, and that's going to make a great reduction in the amount of people who are calling the call center. And so I think that some of the things that Rebecca was talking about, others have so far, is this idea is that the service design experience does not end where the customer, in our case, our business partners, think it is, nor does it end where their customers think it is. I'll use an example. So we're doing some work around social determinants of health. And social determinants of health is this great concept where there's a lot of things that affect patient outcomes that don't relate to what the doctors do, don't relate to what the physicians provide. So we collect all this really great data. We have really smart data scientists who put this information together in these really great data visualizations. And then we give it to the organization and say, look, here's where you're finding opportunities for improvement. Here's where you can save money. But now the provider has to implement it. They have to come up with some intervention that's going to use that. And so we, from our service design point of view, or from a service design perspective, we are trying to work with, again, our business partners who are then selling to those providers to make sure they're helping connect the dots of saying, you're not just looking at the data, you're now trying to solve a problem, you're solving a solution. And then that provider has to implement it. And I think that's where it gets really tough, because you have these silos. You look at where who pays for it. That's the silo that people focus on. How can you move beyond that silo to create a broader experience that's going to ultimately benefit patients and then the payers who work with them?
Yeah, I love that. And I think that it's a great mindset that I think I've seen as a technologist, us shifting to, where we don't just expect people who are forced users of software to deal with a certain experience, but thinking more broadly. And Sara, I'd love your perspective as you maybe closer a little bit to the patient side, how you've seen those other aspects of service design impact the broader picture in your perspective.
Yeah, we all met yesterday to have a chit chat, and one of the things I was talking to this group about was we, like most organizations, we've mapped our entire customer journey, and for us, that is not just the patients, but it's the providers, it's the other clinicians, it's operations, and so we have a lot. I mean, and healthcare is complex, right? And you have people coming in and out at every point along the way. And what we found is that there are certain moments that matter, as we call them, that are really important throughout the journey, and that the ones that have the most impact are the ones that can serve multiple masters. So it's not just that you solve it for the patient, but at the same time, like, you also get to solve it for the clinician on the other side, right? And so, like, those are the moments that matter. Ours are circles, and so they get bigger or smaller depending on how important they are. But like, when you have these multiplying effects on each other, those circles get really large. And so when you think about what that means for the patient, at the end of the day, like, they just want it to be easy, because what we have done in healthcare is make everything so complex that, even when you give them a baseline, what I consider to be a baseline, or even a potentially bad experience in retail or CPG or somewhere else, is viewed as a huge win in healthcare, right? And so, like, there's so much opportunity to change that and to flip the script and to say, what does that entire experience look like, and how do we impact it at every point along the way, so that we didn't just create the new experience that, the scheduling is great, but guess what? Like, there's no appointments, right? So how do we fix that for the patient?
I think
so. Sara, I'm curious about something. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Yep, you're up, Adam.
I was just going to ask a question, Sara, because I think one of the challenges that we have, or maybe we all collectively have, is getting agreement on the moments that matter. So when we work with legal departments, whatever they want is the moment that matters. It doesn't matter whether it's this horrible, really long, agreement that somebody has to agree to. That's the moment that matters. So how do you, or I'm curious for the group at large, how you kind of navigate what moments truly matter? Is it about, well, that's going to create the most revenue, or where do you decide that? I'm curious what you do.
It happens in a variety of different places, right? I mean, I think that a lot of it is, the frequency of which the friction point happens, right? So one of our biggest moments that matters is around transparency and communication. And you hear that repeatedly from every person in that stack, from the patient to the clinician to the operations person. And so things that we can do that help improve that point of friction has a lot of value, because guess what? If I can improve the communication, that can get out of our hospital sooner, right? So I'm helping like from a throughput position. And if length of stay is the metric that I'm trying to measure as the organization to try to bring down that length of stay, like that's a huge impact into the bottom line. And so not only am I increasing the experience, but yeah, there's value, there's business value sitting within those things. That was just one example in terms of throughput, but communication also impacts, how quickly I can get my patient seen, how quickly I can get my medication resolved. So like, am I keeping my patient happy because that communication part is happening? Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also like moving the workflow through the system. And so it's really a combination of things that we're looking at. So in order to make that determination in terms of how big the bubble is.
I like that. Getting agreement on those moments matter, those moments of overlap. Ashley, I know that you've had some experience in kind of determining these categories of things. What have you seen recently in establishing that consensus or shared alignment?
Yeah, I mean, I think you always have to start with understanding the user, and whatever journey you're trying to solve for is just, start by interviewing, and if you can, shadow the person and understand what is their current process. I was recently reading about moments that matter, in fact, and I was reading something that was pretty interesting. There was a company that was trying to understand why their patients weren't showing up to appointments. And they had a hypothesis, they had several hypotheses, but once they talked to a few different consumers, they realized that getting to the appointment was actually the hardest part, especially if you're someone that's disabled and you don't have a caretaker and maybe you don't even have a car. So how can I get myself to that appointment? It causes a lot of anxiety, confusion. What's going to happen once I get there? Even if I am able to take an Uber, is someone going to be able to help me get into a wheelchair once I arrive? And will I know how to get to my appointment? So I think if we just, again, focus on have empathy for our users and really try and meet them where they're at and understand their needs and why certain things aren't occurring. So why they're not coming to their appointments or why they're constantly canceling, it really can shed a lot of light.
Yeah, I would look, a great inspiration for me on that is, I don't know if you guys have heard of City Block Health. And if you haven't, look it up. And there's a bunch of podcasts. And it's exactly what you're saying. It's like uncovering why do they cancel, right? And a lot of times doctors are like, you just never show up. You're not taking the medication. You're not showing up, right? And there's this like war between the two. And I've been at conferences where like you see it happen. And they did all of this, like their approach is to sit down and find out, okay, well, you're going to pick up your kid from daycare and then you're trying to get to work and, you're paid hourly, so you couldn't call in sick. And they were able to really start to bring that empathy to understand and then shape the care to those individual needs. So rather than getting mad at, the doctor getting mad or hitting you with $100 fine because you missed your appointment, approaching it in a way that fits into the life and giving the right care for your needs versus just blasting out standard care across everybody.
What's interesting, Rebecca, is, and it actually ties back to what Adam was talking about earlier in terms of social determinants of health. If you think about like what social determinants do, it's actually the beginning of a conversation with the patient to find out, well, what's going on behind the scenes, right? So why didn't you show up? Well, I have transportation insecurity. Well, why aren't you, following, your medication? Well, I haven't been able to pick it up because I don't have enough money to do that. Or, I have food insecurity or whatever those things are. And so again, I think it goes back to kind of the core of the service design in terms of empathy and getting people to talk to one another, right? So it even goes back to the communication and transparency part. In terms of getting people to actually really talk to one another and providing them with new tools in order to make that happen, right? Because doctors used to know all that stuff because they used to like be in the community in a different way than they are today. So.
it's almost like from my perspective, the way you're talking about it is almost within those moments of matter, there are types of friction that need to be overcome, whether that's communication type friction or something else that are worth dealing with. Briefly, I do want to interject here for those listening. If you do have any questions, please feel free to once again use the Q&A functionality, and we will be getting to those in a few minutes in answering your direct questions. I'd love to switch gears a little bit and to, as you know, we've drilled into these moments of matter and trying to, gain alignment on making a difference for all the types of stakeholders, whether it's operations, patients, providers, or anyone else who's in it in the mix. How do, once we've started developing that service design plan and that service map, how do you see support being kept? How do you make sure that the ball isn't dropped and that stakeholder says, hey, this is too much overhead, we need to just do it and move forward, doesn't come in and all that momentum is lost? And Adam, if you could maybe take a stab at that first, that'd be great.
So I think that's actually probably the hardest part about service design, or at least from my perspective, is because so much of what an organization looks at different operational entities, be it design, UX, be development, whatever. Service design has the potential to become just another silo, just another group that just they push out flow diagrams and they describe the picture, and they're not able to engage on the projects themselves, because ultimately that big picture view prevents them from potentially getting into the details. And so when I think of what we if you don't have a dedicated service design team, if you do have service designers who work alongside the rest of the digital team, for us at least, I would say for our particular group, service design is not really robust. It's a growing part of our business or part of the work that we do in design. It's starting from a place, and I mentioned this on the call the other day, is starting from a place of where we do have trust and expertise and the ability to affect change, and moving out from there. And so using the example of onboarding, we have our core digital experience, and now we're trying to make and improve the onboarding experience. And so we can start to talk to the people who are responsible for the customer success or the customer onboarding from a digital process. So for us, moving in position from a position of strength into service design means that we're not painting ourselves too thin. Same thing on the other side is if we're talking about retention and renewal, where can we share information of things that we do know to improve that process? Obviously, we do want that big picture. We want that complete customer flow and journey map. But for us, it's found as, again, we're growing in service design. We find that we try to move from a position of strength beyond, just a little bit beyond where we have some control, a little bit beyond where we have some influence, rather than jumping completely to the beginning or completely to the end of that complete customer journey, where we're really in, walking on thin ice.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Sara, from your perspective, I'd also be curious, are there any real world stakeholders that you would recommend keeping an eye on in the healthcare space of ensuring that you're continuing to engage along that service design journey in order to necessarily get in front of perhaps any types of users or stakeholders who might throw monkey wrenches into the process of actually implementing a service design plan?
Sure. I think actually Adam mentioned it earlier. Legal can be that roadblock. And I'm not trying to throw and it's really all the kind of like risk and compliance folks, right? Like their entire role in the organization is to be risk averse, right? Yeah. And by nature of what we do, everybody sitting here, is that we are the ones who are pushing, we are the tip of the spear of change and driving our organizations as hard and as fast as we possibly can to make experiences and the world a better our patients and clinicians. And so there's a natural inherent tension and friction in that alone. And so, I would love to say that I have that nut cracked, but I do not. And so, the healthy tension still exists. We're trying to get better about including our legal friends within our advisory councils. Those are organizational groups that help us prioritize our work cross-functionally. And so making sure that they are involved early and often is really where we're trying to make sure that we can help bend that curve a little bit. I mean, if anybody else on the call has any suggestions or recommendations, I'm all ears. I will listen to any suggestion you have, please.
I work in pharma.
So might be first for you.
Most of the health industries when it comes to MLR, medical legal review. I love your idea. I think that that's such a good approach to how do you bring them in earlier and make them feel like they're a part of a team versus that roadblock where it's like, oh, I have to go to them, right? Like it's like the walk of death at times where you're like, they're going to squash all my dreams.
Is it like eating your vegetables, right? You have a meal and you eat your vegetables first. Maybe you start with legal first because you know that's going to be an obstacle. You get over that. That's the thing you do first just to make sure that they are on your side. And then in some respects, maybe that gives a little bit of clout. Because if you've got legal on your side, wow, you must have done something pretty special. So particularly from a pharma or medical products perspective, that's a tough place to be. So maybe it's part of getting legal to have your back, to be your advocates. That's that spear, I think, that you're talking about, Sarah.
Yeah.
I love these analogies. Ashley, what's your perspective on gaining these advocates who might not by default be advocates, the vegetables or the back end of the spear people, depending on our analogy?
Sure. I totally agree with everyone. I think obviously it's important to get the right people in from the very beginning. So not only do they buy into the process, but they've helped you get to wherever you're going. And I think anytime you can rely on data, obviously that goes a really long way. And I think when some of our clients hear about service design, it sounds intimidating. But if you really break it down to the simplicity, it's just start small, solve one problem, and come up with a proof of concept and just they say if you talk with just 5 users, you'll solve 85% of your usability flaws. So you really don't even need to be communicating with that many people to truly feel that, no, we've got a product here that people want, need, and we're not only solving patients' pain points, but we're also going to solve some provider pain points and customer support pain points along the way.
So I'd like to have one more question, and then we're going to switch to audience questions here. But really, I'd like to ask a question that I know many of the panelists here have some perspective, all of you have some perspective on, which is if we take a look at other industries, healthcare is monumentally complex and very different. But are there any other lessons from other industries, whether it be retail or manufacturing, and the way that they've implemented service design that you've seen that should be taken as a lesson for service design in healthcare and brought forward moving forward? Sarah, I'd love to start with you, kind of maybe from that retail perspective. Are there lessons that you've seen applied in retail that, oh man, these are great ones that we should bring into the healthcare or provider space?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, the biggest transition for me when I moved into healthcare was not having the amount of data on my customers that I thought would be readily available, right? So having worked in retail and quick serve restaurants and things like that, like all that data is just sitting there and it's like, bloop, bloop, plug and play and, pull the feed and do the thing. And, it's like magic and it just happens, right? That doesn't happen in healthcare and it's very disjointed. And so from my perspective, what healthcare can learn from retail and other places is how can we get our data house in better order? And so our organization is spending a lot of time in this space so that we have a better understanding of who that customer is. Yes, I know that there are, again, legal requirements about like what you can and can't share in terms of information. But to have that broader picture of that customer across the board, whether they're before the login, after the login, how does all of that work together? I think is really critical.
Yeah, great. And Rebecca, from your perspective, is there anything that pharma should learn from any other industry or from what you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, data, I believe that the future of healthcare and kind of, really helping everybody engaged is the sharing of data and the collaboration. And if you think about pharma, right, they're sometimes the opposite of collaboration because we're all rushing to find the next drug and, there's a competitive standpoint there. Although I love seeing what's going on with COVID, in terms of collaboration, where a lot of, the science community in general is really coming together for one of the, the first times in a very long time to try to solve a really big problem. But it is so siloed. So even coming from financial, right? People will say, oh, the regulatory and the legal, you get it. And it's like, no, not at all. In health, it's so much more complex, because when you think about that journey of data for a patient, all the doctors that they see are not connected. The EHRs are not connected. Now you have telehealth, which is not connected. And so I think that the big transformation has to be around that collaboration and the shared data platform. Understanding PHI and PII is a huge challenge, but I think we're slowly getting there. I think that's why you see companies hiring AI specialists, and they're rebuilding platforms, because a lot of platforms are old and antiquated and can't handle the ability to have transparency, as Sara was talking about, when you think about data and messaging and communication. So I think, I'm still trying. I've been doing health for 8 years, and I'm still trying to crack that nut of how do you streamline some of healthcare and make it so things can come together across the full patient journey, not just with that one provider or that hospital or that pharma company.
Yeah.
I'll be really interested to see how the Cures Act really helps with the data and the sharing and the interoperability. So that's going to be a game changer. Like it's going to be like, 2006 all over again with all of the retail brands, I think. So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, COVID, right? Tracing is like exactly that. It's like the perfect example of governments and everybody coming together for a common purpose.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I think when it comes to, part of it is sort of choosing your battles. I heard someone say once, I apologize, I don't remember who, but that basically they said that the best service design problems are ambiguous, not complicated. So some problems are so very complicated that you're spending half of your time mapping out the problem set itself. And in some respects, that's almost too big of a thing for service design to solve. It's you get these ideas of wicked problems in design space, these things that maybe don't have one solution. That's where service design, I think, really thrives, really benefits, because they can start to say, well, let's try to examine this. Where can we change this lever? Where can we push things in a certain direction or another? And I think that's where, as a service designer, you need to move forward with confidence in ambiguity, of saying, we're going to test a hypothesis. We're going to try this out based on the limitations of what we try to map everything out in a very, very, very exact way. Then we.
Adam, I think we might be having some connection problems with your connection here. Ashley, is there anything else
to run and be able to solutions? That's where I think services. Yes, it's complicated, but it's also.
Oh, it looks like you're back. Sorry about that. We lost about 10 seconds. Ashley, is there anything that you...
It was a bad 10 seconds.
I'm sure. I don't believe that. Anyway, Ashley, is there, from your perspective, is there anything that you feel like healthcare in the provider space that you're working should learn from other industries that you've seen?
I think other industries have honestly paved the way for healthcare very nicely. I think there is just so much overlap in what we do with retail, quick service restaurants. Sarah, it sounds like we have a similar background. I think even when you release something out into the world, we need to understand that impact to operations as well. So if we were to launch a brand new tool, are we going to be able to handle that? I was working with a quick service restaurant where they were offering coupons. You could get a free item. And they didn't think about the expiration date being the same for every single person. And every single person came in to redeem their free food on the same day, and they didn't have any food to give out. So it's not only thinking about how do we solve the immediate problem, but what does that look like going into implementation as well? And are we ready for it operationally?
Yeah. That's a really interesting one. So with that, I'd love to switch to some audience questions. And I'm gonna start with the first one I have here, which was a participant asks, I was introduced to a physical service delivery mapping app called GoShadow while attending an Institute for Healthcare Improvement conference and felt it had great potential, as one could map services from patients from arrival in the parking lot / valet to the active office. actual office or visit or procedure room. Do you recommend any particular tools for documentation of digital service mapping? And Ashley, I see you nodding. Do you have any experience with this tool or others that you would recommend?
I haven't heard of that tool, but Miro has become my new best friend. I honestly, it's one of the only tools I've been using lately. It's essentially a giant whiteboarding tool, and it has a ton of templates that are ready to go. And anyone can get on and either comment, edit, create their own board, whatever they need to do. So it's been a really nice tool. You can password protect it and share it with your clients if you pay for that feature. I feel like I'm giving them a nice ad right now, but I really do love it.
I saw a couple of nods. Rebecca, you were nodding as well with Miro.
Oh yeah, it's awesome. We use it all the time, and you can save it as a PDF and print it if you want to do physical workshops with it. But especially, with Takeda, I work globally, and so collaboration is so easy with Miro. You can comment, you can follow threads, and it's cheap compared to a lot of the other software. I remember doing them in Illustrator, for you designers, right? How hellish was that? So yes, big vote for me on Miro.
Yeah, absolutely. So Adam, here's one I think that would be interesting for you to answer. A participant asks, how have you succeeded or failed at positioning service designers? So it sounds like you're beginning from a position of strength here. Positioning service designers or leveraging service design within the enterprise.
How have we leveraged service design within the enterprise? So I think part of it is when it comes to the platforms that we support, these are very, very large software tools with multiple teams involved with the success or failure of those different platforms. And I think where the success has happened, again, we're growing in this area as far as helping people identify service design as an important part. Where I think that the successes are happening is part of what's already been mentioned a little bit of helping them catch the bigger vision beyond where their silo is, the bigger division beyond where just their product line is, of saying, we've got data in this system, this other system uses that same data. And I'll use an example. We have had 2 different products that use the same claims data, the same patient data. And these 2 different products had 2 different ways that data needed to be shared. So one team, if I were the client, the hospital, I would load the same set of data for this FTP site and this FTP site for 2 different products. And it's crazy. And it becomes this thing of saying, how do you find blended services, or how do you find places of convergence? And it's sort of, in some cases, I think the most successful parts have been, at the end of the day, we're trying to create opportunities for the organization. It's kind of reminding them of the bigger picture. And I find that that's been the most successful thing that we've done so far. Where I think we've failed is, again, overlooking where their incentives are. And I don't just mean financially, overlooking kind of where they find benefit and value. So if I'm saying this system that used to be a product really logically becomes a subset of another product, that's really scary. So how do you identify value for this team so that they can kind of quote unquote give up control? And part of that is kind of giving them that big picture, kind of seeing where they are in that complete chain. So I think using journey maps is a huge benefit, because they may be touching some very, very small part, but reminding them of where they are in that journey, I think helps center them to that bigger picture of where the organization and where the users are trying to go, or your customers are trying to go.
Right. Thank you, Adam. The next question we have here, Sara, I'd love for you to kind of take a stab at this. Where within an organization should the discipline of service design or service designers themselves live to create the biggest impact?
Oh, good question. So, we call our people user experience designers and strategists. So we haven't quite elevated to the level of service design, although from my understanding and conversations on my team, we do actually do a lot of service design. So that sits within the product team. But we also have, there are parts within our lean promotion office that they do service design, right? As you think about lean operations and some of the work that they do. And then we also have a transformation acceleration team under strategy, and they also do a lot of this type of work too. So we're kind of a three-headed monster in that respect. It's kind of popping up in different places. So I don't know if it has a specific home at the moment within Ohio Health, other than user experience technically lives within product. But when I see what other people in the organization are doing, we're like, we could easily grab arms and link arms and, take up the same, the same fight together.
I've also been noticing a trend within agencies over the last few years where they're spinning up innovation teams that are solely to focus on solving problems that service design can help to solve. So they'll put together little pods or little teams where you can essentially innovate around any problem, or you can look at a current process and try and identify gaps and problems and then create proof of concepts that you can essentially test to understand, is it going to be desirable, viable, and feasible? And then if it makes it through, then, potentially you can start building on that product.
I think that's a great idea is thinking about this idea. I heard the idea of service design rather than the role of service designers, and how do we resolve that broader concept rather than the role itself of who is doing this work.
I think it's personally for me, it's just another tool. I think in the industry, right, like Sarah, you call them experience designers, I call them product designers, Ashley and Adam, you might call them something else. I look at the service map and that process to really be a tool versus a specialty. And I know in the industry, exactly, Ashley, at Sapient, we started a whole service design team and we sold it as a capability, right, as a product that we could help customers with. And I always struggled with it a little bit because then we also had digital product innovation. And I was like, well, isn't the service made up of products, right? Like it can get really messy. So that's why I'm just like, there's a lot of different tools to get to where we need to go. And I don't necessarily need to do a 6-month service design project always, right? I might be able to just pick a key moment that matters and go deep in that moment versus look across a whole thing. So I think there's lots of tools, and it's just to be aware of what's the right tool for what you're trying to accomplish versus sometimes we get stuck on, at least in the agency, I sold a service design project, so I have to do these deliverables and this process. And then you get into it and you're like, well, it doesn't really matter, but I kind of have to do it because that's what I sold, right? So I think it's just being aware that it's just another tool in our tool set.
Yeah. So the next question actually, I think, talks a little bit about the application of that tool. A participant asked, what are some of the challenges that you have had to tackle in trying to get alignment through service design and establish that shared view, especially as we have these maybe moments that matter with multiple stakeholders who may have different perspectives on how that moment matters? Sara, do you have any perspective on that?
Just in terms of like how to get alignment and keep people together. I mean, Ohio Health is a really large organization. We spend a large amount of time socializing and having conversations across the spectrum about not only the kind of ebb and flow of where the customer journey map is going, because it's changing, right? It's a living, breathing document. And so it's one of those things where, we show it in one meeting and then 2 weeks later, there could be a new bubble of a moment that matters because the research and the work that's happening in other spaces, lending to the overall vision and journey. And so it's a constant touch point for us that we always go back to. So pretty much any presentation that you get from anybody on the product team is going to have the journey map so that we can talk about it in some capacity, because we have to be able to, again, for us, when you think about that human-centered design, if you don't talk about the humans at the beginning of every meeting, then kind of like, what are we doing there? And so it's a grounding point for us. And it's a reminder to everybody, like, okay, we're here for this reason. And these are the people that matter.
I think adding to that, this idea of alignment is often not like exactly what Sara said. It's not a single meeting. it's not going to come together. You're not going to bring all these heads of departments and they're going to have this amazing, you're going to nail the presentation and they're going to come away crying and believing what you have. A lot of the cases, you're going to find people who are closer in alignment and they're more quickly able to understand where you're going. And some people are going to be further away. And so you do have, I think it's really helpful to have that kind of bigger picture, long view. That description that I made of the 2 different data groups, that hasn't been completely solved yet. That's because that's long-term work. But as we show that we're winning on these quicker, smaller things, these moments that matter, I love that term, you find that there's more and more alignment. And so someone who in a previous meeting was half paying attention when you presented, now they're a little more interested. Now they're a little more interested. That alignment takes place slowly over time, or at least our experience, particularly with large organizations.
Yeah, Adam, I that's so on point, is the small wins to show momentum, to get buy-in from longer term initiatives with stakeholders, right? Because I think sometimes as designers, we can get sucked in a little bit too much to kind of the bigger vision, and the small wins, low-hanging fruit, whatever you want to call it, just aren't as exciting. But it's almost like politics sometimes, even whether you're client facing or you're internal, right? I always think about it as, how do you get that buy-in momentum? How do you build those relationships? How do you get, people to kind of help push the vision forward? But yeah, and the same thing with, I love, Sara, that you kind of bring it up in all your meetings, because I think one of the dangers that I see happen is these journey maps and service maps take so long and they end up like in an email. Right. And it's like, how do you make that? Yeah. Right. So that's what Mural Board is great for. But how do you keep going back to it so it is a living, breathing document? Because sometimes you'll hear that it could take 6 to 9 months to do a very detailed service map. And for me, my always mandate has been like a week. Like I give myself a time thing, and it's like, we're going to get as far as we can, and then we'll iterate, because people start to lose patience. Or you go back and you said, I spent this 6 months, and they're like, well, what did you do with it? And it's like, well, it's in an email somewhere. No one's really looked at it since then. So yeah.
Yeah, that's tough.
Or
Ashley-
COVID hits and all priorities change.
Well, but that's the point about like the iteration, right? Like we talked about like, being agile and, so we work on 2-week sprints. And, my team jokes with me. I'm like, I love demo day. Like it's my favorite day of every 2 weeks, because like to see the work every 2 weeks and to be able to comment, to understand where the work is, to see where anything has changed in the business. Things change all the time, right? And so, being able to accept risk changes. It's very different when it's a 2-week worth of risk versus worth of risk, right? And so getting my organization used to that type of risk, that's been a journey, right? Because they're used to like, well, where's everything? And I'm like, well, I'm going to deliver a minimum viable product or minimum feasible product or minimum marketable product, however you guys want to, pick your M word. I'm going to deliver that, and then we're going to see. And so that very different mindset within our organization, but it helps in terms of like, we're winning, right? Like we're learning, we're moving, we're failing fast, we're doing all of those buzzwordy things. But it really does help with the risk tolerance in the org.
That's a great point. I think that's another area that I think I've heard healthcare evolve a little bit in that minimum viable product, minimum star product category. We've got time for one more participant question. And then we'll close it out. So the last one here is on the topic of creating a service for people with issues getting to appointments. Is there any research surveys on the popularity of telehealth to persuade stakeholders who resist such a change? And Ashley or Sara, I see you about to answer here. I don't know if you've seen some research.
Yeah, the data that's coming in on telehealth and its acceptance, both on the provider and on the provider side and on the customer side, is like it's a hockey stick. It's it's undeniable. Basically, COVID created a market for telehealth overnight. And so what we've seen as we've been able to go back to business is we have seen those levels decrease, right? And it's now starting to, whoever asked the question, one of the challenges, and we're seeing this throughout healthcare, is it's giving the providers in particular who might not be as advanced or might not want to see telehealth take off, it's giving them that wiggle room to be like, well, I don't know, like the experience isn't perfect, but I'm here to tell you it's here to stay. All of the research that we're seeing is that is the future of where things are going. It's also going to be the way that healthcare finally bends the curve on cost, because you're going to finally be able to move out of bricks and sticks and physical buildings and be able to see more people and to actually provide that level of care for rising risk and high risk patients. We could probably have a whole nother webinar on just virtual health. I'm happy to have any offline conversation with anybody. I've spent a lot of time in this space, particularly in the last 6 to 9 months. And so I personally think that this is the area of true excitement within healthcare, and it's really going to be the thing that really changes the game. Ohio Health was able to put over 1,000 providers onto telehealth in mere weeks, which never would have been thought of. It would have taken us 3 years to do that. It took us 3 weeks. Wow. So yeah, COVID was the digital transformation fire starter. That's for sure.
Rebecca, I see you nodding. Is there anything else that you'd want to add to what Sara shared?
No, I mean, exactly that, right? Like everyone's been talking about telehealth for years, and the adoption was always really low, and it just exploded. I think it helps for all of us doing digital, design within health. It's really given us a bit more of a platform to stand on and focus on those tools, so COVID is a horrible, situation that we're dealing with. But when it comes to digital transformation in health, it really has pushed it along faster than we could have imagined it to happen.
And Adam, have you seen the same sort of fire starter effect in the enterprise software that you've been delivering?
Well, I mean, again, enterprise, we don't necessarily do telehealth in the way that you do with a patient provider, but we do definitely find that a lot more of the tools that were previously done, what we'd call on-premise, systems that are on-premise managed in a closed space, people are having to move and wanting to move into more cloud-based scenarios. And that again brings up a new complication in that service design experience, because now you're talking about supporting a new way of engaging, a new way of interacting. And even if the interfaces are similar, again, there's a digital screen of some sort, you have all new ways of how you're supposed to support that. So again, the telehealth is definitely one of those great big efforts that are happening across healthcare, but I think it kind of shows you how much more ubiquitous digital services can be when they are delivered virtually rather than face-to-face or in a patient experience. And that again lends itself, again, a plug for more service design of recognizing there's things happening before and after that interaction that's digital.
Yeah. And Ashley, from your perspective, are we seeing, from your work with I think the provider side more so, are we seeing similar, is there anything you'd like to add to what's been said so far?
No, I don't think so. I think everyone's spot on. I mean, we're in a situation where it's an unfortunate thing, but it has pushed, like Rebecca said, a big transformation digitally. I think it's going to take a bit to kind of catch everything up. We already have, like I think Sara mentioned, we already have EHRs that can't communicate, and now we have telehealth platforms that can't communicate with one another. So now we just have new gaps and new problems to solve for, but it's great, and it's the right time to do it.
Fantastic. Well, we're at time. I want to thank everybody for joining today, and all of our participants who were able to share their knowledge and their experiences. If you have any other questions, there will be a follow-up email with ways to continue the conversation, as well as a highlight reel of today's conversation. Thank you all for joining, and I hope each of you learned as much as I did from this conversation. And stay tuned to your inboxes and have a great rest of your day.